Welcome back to the Dirt Diaries Explorers, especially those who are lounging in the villa, taking notes in the library, and snooping in the restricted section. We're diving into an ancient crime. Yeah, a crime. And this episode was actually inspired by seeing the mummified remains of the pharaoh Ramses III in Cairo prior to the tour starting at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. And when my husband and I were in the exhibit, we noticed some of these mummies actually had the results posted from CT scans that they had undergone. And because my husband, Kevin, is a cancer research scientist and has some medical training from the past, we actually discussed what would happen to the body when the body would have certain types of injuries. So he wanted to know what would have caused certain blunt force trauma from an ancient weapon and archaeological perspective. And I wanted to know the inner workings of how the body would react to trauma from a medical perspective. So, for example, when we saw the mummy of the father of the ruler Ahmose I of Dynasty 18, his father is Sekenere Tau. There was trauma next to and above his orbital socket, which is his eye. And there was a massive gaping fracture of the frontal bone in his skull that was likely caused by an axe. But this is, of course, a story for another time. Because today we're here to talk about a mummy murder mystery, one that is about 300 years after Ahmose I reunites Egypt and begins Dynasty 18. Today, we're heading to the Ramesside period to the reign of Ramses III. The year is 1155 BCE. It's Dynasty 20 of the New Kingdom, and the reign of Ramses III has come to a startling end. He was just assassinated. Ramses III was the last great pharaoh of Egypt, who inherited the throne during a tumultuous time. He would be tasked with defending her borders at the beginning of his reign against the Libyans, and just a few years later, he and Egypt would be sucked into the power vacuum of the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean world. But he had survived the attacks from the Sea Peoples and the Libyans. So, what, or more importantly, who caused his death? Sure, during his reign, he faced the world's oldest sit in strike by his laborers and workers for their proper pay. But this was motivated by the decline in the New Kingdom, which ultimately was affecting his workers, the amount of food they received, and so much more. There was also some environmental factors that he couldn't control. But after these workers had their needs met, they really wouldn't rebel against him. So, who did this? And in order to tackle this ancient crime, we need to first look at how he was killed. This will help narrow down not only who could have carried out the crime, but who would want him dead. The suspect list will also help narrow down a specific motive for killing the God King himself. So I hope you guys are ready for an ancient episode of Law and Order. Now, to tackle the cause of death, it's a pretty interesting story because the cause of death was only pretty recently discovered. That's right, because back in 1886, treasure hunters discovered the tomb of Ramses III. And because it wasn't found by archaeologists, there was no documentation of where his body was, which is pertinent, as there were other mummies inside the tomb. Now, from outside the wrappings, nothing gave any hint that the king had been killed. And even when the impatient antiquarians unwrapped him, there was no outright evidence to suggest that he had died from unnatural causes. There were no distinct signs of trauma or injury that would have raised any eyebrows. Even more confusing into this already unknown problem was that there was another mummy buried alongside the pharaoh, a smaller mummy with a contorted, seemingly screaming face. Unlike the other mummies in the tomb, who were buried in ceremonial garments and carefully embalmed and mummified, this small mummy had been wrapped in a simple sheepskin and seemingly placed haphazardly within the tomb without an inscription pointing to their identity. This man, because of this, would be termed as Unknown Man E, or you may recognize him as the Screaming Mummy, and we will come back to him. So, when researchers used an x ray machine on the late pharaoh in the 1960s, It showed no signs of assassination. Okay. But in 2012, thanks to a CT scan that was done, it actually revealed that Ramses III's abdominal organs had been replaced with figurines of Horus, the Egyptian god associated with healing, and amulets of the Eye of Horus had been placed in his neck and around his feet. But there was more. His neck had been slashed to the bone, suggesting that he was, in fact, assassinated. There was also another finding. The pharaoh was missing part of his right big toe. The cut suggests that it was done prior to death and was likely done by an axe or a sword. Now, the placing of the amulets suggests that during mummification, they were actively placed by his feet and on his neck to heal the king in the afterlife, to make him whole again, as the Eye of Horus was used for such healing purposes. Perhaps those who were mummifying the late king thought to give him the best shot at healing in the afterlife, they put extra care into where they were placing these specific amulets. But what's interesting about said cause of death is that it suggests that there were at least two attackers, one who likely attacked from the back and the other from the front. The attacker from behind not only slashed his throat, no, the attacker cut through the trachea and his esophagus, killing him almost instantly. And while it would have been a quick and sudden death for the king, it was also a bloody one. And from everything that I just said, we know two things. One, that there were multiple attackers, and two, that they needed to be close enough to cut his throat, suggesting that the pharaoh not only knew his attackers, but trusted them enough to let them close to him. Truly, we're in the midst of a murder mystery. And with this knowledge of how he was killed, we can begin to narrow down who we should suspect. Who's sus in the ancient world? Who would be able to get close enough to the pharaoh with such a weapon? And this also begs another question. Where would these individuals have been able to kill him? And to better understand the crime scene, we must narrow down the place the crime took place. When we look at the complex at Medinet Habu, we see the temple complex. And then on the south side has the palace residence of the king, where he would stay when he was in Thebes, along with the throne room. We also see near his residence rooms for the women of the harem. So we should ask ourselves, were the suspects able to get to him in the throne room after asking for an audience with him? Well, the only way to get into the complex is through the main gate, which was controlled by guards, meaning the culprit likely was inside already, or was someone known to the guards who was able to enter and exit at will without raising any suspicion. And to get to the throne room, you would have to then traverse through the main courtyard and a few more checks before entering. And say we had an audience with the pharaoh here, there would have been personal guards posted throughout, and perhaps even one who would have searched us before allowing us to appear before the king. And, well, a weapon used for slashing throats, like a dagger, would have been a huge no. That would have been confiscated. We likely would have been dragged away. And the size of the throne room here is easy enough to control, even with a few guards. So, were assassins sent to the throne room where he was probably the most protected? Probably not. That is probably the safest place in the world for the pharaoh at the time. So that's likely where he was not killed. And next door to the palace is an area called the House of Life, which houses all of the magical spells necessary for the protection and the life of the king. The knowledge this area offered in terms of what magic was known was considered to be extremely powerful. Now, the crime likely didn't occur here in the House of Life, but those involved with said crime most definitely used the knowledge and resources from here in order to strip the king of his magical protections, and perhaps even binded his personal guards to ensure that the assassination occurred without issue. Because when an assassination takes place, we have to ask why. Most of the time, it has to do with the exchange of power. And with Ramses III, we see exactly that in the Game of Thrones. So, with that being said, the attackers would have chosen both a place and a time that had little risk for them. You didn't want to get caught, right? And thus, that brings us to another place located near the palace and the throne room, the harem. It's probably the one place the king would go and not be surrounded by his guards. Why? Because the harem was where the intimate private life of the pharaoh takes place. All of his wives and children lived here, multiple women vying for his attention, multiple sons vying to be heir. Competition was everywhere. And here, the guards would have kept a respectful distance from their king as to not intrude. And some scholars have even suggested that perhaps the guards did not even follow him if he left for the harem. And if the king went to the harem unguarded, he also would have likely let his own guard down because he felt comfortable. Why? Because he was surrounded by the women who loved him. He was surrounded by his children who loved him, a place where he thought no danger could live. And if this was in fact where the crime happened, did a woman perhaps plan this? And did other women in the harem know? The answer is absolutely to both. And to better understand, let's move to the suspects. And actually, from ancient history, we get some help with potential suspects and conspirators from an ancient Egyptian text known today as the Turin Judicial Papyrus. Now, this papyrus scroll was discovered in a market in Egypt in the 1820s and reveals what may have taken place. Now, as Ramses III had many wives at the same time, one of these women shows up as a major player in this judicial manuscript. Her name is Ta, and she is not mentioned alone. Nay, nay. She's mentioned with her son, Pentawere. According to the document, it was Ta who felt destined for greater things and coveted the role of chief royal wife. As one of the queens of Ramses III, she wanted likely what many of the women wanted for their sons, to be heir to the throne, and thus becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt until the passing of their father. The declaration of said heir would also allow for the mother to gain some power as well. No easy task considering the pharaoh had dozens of sons. And this is a quick side note in the murder mystery. The son of a lesser queen could have been heir to the throne. We see this in the passing of power, especially in other times throughout Egyptian history. I mean, we even see it with the pharaoh Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, or Tutankhaten at the time that he was born and known. He was not the son of Nefertiti, who was the chief royal wife of Akhenaten. No, he was born of a secondary wife to Akhenaten. So, yes, can a son of a secondary wife of a lesser queen of the pharaoh become heir to the throne? Absolutely. We've seen it before. But likely it would have gone to the chief queen's son. But if none were available, he would also be looking around to see who would best succeed him. But back to the story, because at one point at the temple of Medinet Habu, there is a cartouche bearing the name of the king's successor, that of the name of Ramses IV, not Pentawere or any of his other half brothers. It was Ramses IV, the son of his wife, Titi, not to be confused with the mother of Pentawere, Ta. Yet, although we now have an heir named, we don't exactly know when this took place and why he specifically chose his son with Titi over the sons he had with his other wives. And I will say it may have to do with age, Ramses III ruled over 30 years and no doubt outlived some of his children. And why am I bringing this up? Because it's something that we see again throughout Egyptian history is when you have a pharaoh who is ruling for quite some time, there becomes an issue of succession later on. And for instance, we kind of see this play out in Dynasty 19 with Ramses II a little bit. Of course, Ramses II ruled for about 70 years, and his son and successor, Merneptah, was in fact his 13th son. The other 12 had predeceased their father. And when we see periods of long reign, we run into succession issues. We see dynasties ending a lot quicker. We see power shifting a lot more. Or we may even see some female rulers assume the position of king. So, why was Ramses IV picked over Pentawere? Well, Ramses IV was also about twice the age of Pentawere. So maybe he had more training in terms of the administrative side. Maybe he already kind of was groomed to be the next pharaoh. It's very unclear, but nonetheless, it definitely peeved some people. Perhaps not being named heir was enough of a personal motive for Pentawere and his mother, Ta. I mean, it's a pretty good personal motive, but to take control over the whole state of Egypt, you wouldn't simply just need to kill the current pharaoh and take control of the pharaonic office. You would also need to control the religious side through priests, but you would also need to control the militaristic side through the army as well, meaning our list of suspects is now even longer and really unravels a tangled web of power. Now, the Turin Judicial Papyrus actually lists about three groups of conspirators. The first being palace employees, then we have military officers, and then we even see priests and scribes and other officials. But let's tackle some of the most mentioned or possibly those who were mostly involved with this scheme. To begin with the palace employees, we see the name Pabekamen over and over again. He is the head of the food chamber to the harem and to a large part of the palace with this position. Nobody would question why he's moving about the halls, why he would be going to the throne room, why he would be going to the harem, why he would be going amongst his business, likely not going to be questioned. It is stated that Ta was able to convince him to join, plan, and even execute the plan. He is named as the grand conspirator in the papyrus in connection to the murder, meaning he likely played a huge role. But while he is named as head of the food chamber, we kind of get a little judicial pickle, if you will, because no such position exists. It's believed that he likely held a role in the kitchen and overall may have been a low ranking administrative figure who wouldn't have been able to approach the pharaoh alone, unannounced, or get close enough to kill him. But perhaps he was roped in to the larger conspiracy on the hopes that there would be an exchange after the exchange of power. Let's say they succeeded and Pentawere was placed on the throne. Perhaps Pabekamen was told he would gain a new title. Perhaps there was bribery. But whatever the reason, he is listed as a major player in this conspiracy. Next on the list is a butler, which is very rare to see in documentation because they are represented in pharaonic artwork as serving the king and everything. But documentation concerning who they are, their daily activities, is very rare to see in ancient papyrus. So to see it here means something is afoot. We actually see three close personal servants that are listed in the judicial papyrus. One of them listed goes by the name of Metsure. Now, the position of butler guarantees that you would have been in daily contact with the king, and if you were this close of a servant of his, you wouldn't really ever need to ask for an audience with the king. The king would ask to see you. You may have been a personal confidant of the king. He may have pulled his butlers aside and told them things in private because they were somebody that he could trust. But with all of that power, perhaps he used it to help the other conspirators. Now, Mezitsure is high on the suspect list, right underneath Pabeka Men, suggesting another large role. He would know exactly where the pharaoh would be at any time of any day, and he could approach the king who would suspect nothing. And perhaps with this information of basically almost having like a daily planner of what the pharaoh was doing, he may have passed that on to the conspirators. But what's interesting is if the plan took place elsewhere, we have to also think where he could stay. And what's interesting to note is that Mezitsure could not stay in the harem. So while they had people on the inside, so to say, inside the palace, they didn't just have to succeed with that, with the assassination within the palace. They also had to win and take control through a military coup as well. And we actually have some names of those involved. We see a man by the name of Paez, who was a general in the military, and he is mentioned as his soldiers were supposed to be placed outside the temple complex. And it was him who was to use the army to secure power for TA and Pentaware. Okay, so we have the pharaonic office of who may have been involved. We have the military side with a potential coup, but we also have to get the religious side because we have to now get rid of the spells that were protecting the king. So enter in Parakamenef, who was likely a priest of Sekhmet, who used formulas and magical incantations to strip the king of magical protection, as well as the protection that his guards also had. Now, he likely performed ancient binding rituals for the conspirators to ensure that the king was open to be killed, meaning he did perform a ritual, but probably didn't kill the king personally. So, why would we need a priest to perform magic on the king and his guards? Because the king at this point in ancient history, in ancient Egypt, was considered to be divine and divinely protected. So, in order to, in a sense, make him mortal and able to be killed, you had to know the proper spells and incantations to strip the pharaoh of those so that he was no longer divinely protected, so that the gods who were said to watch over the kings of Egypt would almost turn a blind eye to what was going to take place, and of the guards as well. It is said that Parakamenef also may have performed binding rituals on his guards by creating almost wax figurines of them and wrapping them and even piercing them with sharp objects. Now, this is not to cause them pain, as many might, be thinking today, but in fact, ancient binding rituals concerning magic like this, when you pierce a figurine of an individual, it actually is not meant to cause pain. It's actually meant to make sure that you can't move. And of course, when you are wrapping them with rope or twine or anything like that, it's also to ensure that you cannot move, that you cannot do anything but what the spell is saying for you to do. So, likely in this instance, it would be to strip them of the protection of the king, strip the guards of their own personal protection magically, and to ensure that the guards could not move, the guards could not protect their king, the guards could not raise their weapons, if you will. But, okay, Parakamenef did the ritual, but did he kill the king? Probably not. And yes, I know I mentioned that other women must have known about this conspiracy. And yes, we know of at least one who knew. And this is because the commander of the Nubian archers, Benemwaset's sister, who was part of the harem during the reign of Ramses III, sent him a letter telling him to incite the people and to start rebelling. And it seems like other women had also known about the murder and had too turned on their king. So, potentially for suspects, we have a TA whose son may have been seen as robbed as being the heir to the throne. We have palace employees such as Pabeka Men. We have Mezitsure, the royal butler. We have PAs, the general in the military. We have Parakamenef, the court magician. And we know of the commander of the Nubian archers, Biman Waset, and his sister, who was part of the harem. So we know that these individuals played a role. But let's go back to another suspect who I have mentioned before, that of unknown man E, found near the body of Ramses III. And if you recall, he wasn't mummified properly, or you could argue even at all, indicating that this may have been done as a punishment in the afterlife. Could this have been perhaps Pentawere, the one who may have committed patricide? Well, according to DNA analysis, it shows that he is the biological son of Ramses III, potentially that of Pentawere. But did the son of Ramses III in fact turn on his father? Well, if we look at the evidence, Pentawere would have been highly trained and skilled in combat. He may have had a personal motive concerning not being named heir to the throne. And, well, look at his poorly prepared mummy, meaning he did something bad to ensure that his body was maltreated for the afterlife. Okay, so who was his immediate accomplice if there were two killers? Well, under circumstantial evidence, it could be TA, his mother. As she lived in the harem, she knew it basically like back of her hand. She had personal motive for her son not becoming heir to the throne. And to carry out this murder, she would have done so with her son, who she trusted implicitly in this. So it would make sense for the murder to have, in fact, been carried out by mother and son. And it is, in fact, believed that they did kill the king. But when they did so, the military never came to back them. And this means, did the military just show up late? Did something intercept a message? Or were they arrested immediately or shortly after the crime occurred? Or another possibility, was the assassination seen by somebody? And it's kind of thought it could be a mixture of somebody seeing it go on, guards rushing in and arresting them almost immediately in kind of like the chaos, and Ramses the Fourth really coming in and taking over and taking control immediately over the situation itself. Because if they weren't caught, if Pentawere and his mother weren't caught in the act, or really it getting out and known, the body of Ramses III may have gone missing, and Pentawere would have assumed the throne in so many actions so that nobody would have assumed, a suspicious event took place, that Pentawere assumed the throne under, suspicious activities. It would have been a lot more smooth. But what we're seeing, of course, aside from the court documentation, is we're seeing an assassination that it went through, but it was very choppy, and power and control was lost almost immediately when they slit the throat of the pharaoh. They couldn't control basically the job any further. So immediately arrested was TA, Pentawere, harem women, officials, confidants, and others were brought in and were interrogated. And when I say interrogated, I mean it in the fullest and harshest aspect. They weren't just asked about what they saw. Likely those who they knew were part of it were likely tortured as well. And, probably they just confessed under duress. But those who confessed, we see different punishments dealt out to different individuals. So for some accomplices in this conspiracy, some of them had ears and noses cut off, and they were allowed to live, but you would have to live wearing this scar basically for the rest of your life. And the ears being slashed off and the noses being removed, people would know what that meant. People would know if you were walking down the ancient street that you did something horrible. Next on the list are Pebeka men and Meset Sure, and their fate basically was they were burned to death, which was in fact probably a fate worse than death to the ancient Egyptians. Why? Because your body is gone, it turns to ash. And with no body, you have no afterlife. You have nothing. Kaput, your journey to the beyond is done. You don't even get a journey to the beyond. So basically, in every sense of the word, they are eliminated in history, in body, in soul, in afterlife. They are just erased. So those two, and likely others, were burned alive. And then we get to Pentaware and other high officials, likely nobility who may have been involved in the conspiracy. They were allowed to take their life via suicide. They were allowed to decide how they would die, which is also why when we look at the mummified remains of unidentified man E, who is now known as the biological son of Ramses III, for so long when archaeologists were looking at those remains, they couldn't tell how this individual died. And because his face is in a screaming position, they really didn't understand what could cause that. But because his body was not mummified properly, or at all, you could argue, the muscles in his face actually ended up causing that screaming pose that he is in today. And it is believed by scholars that he could have died by poisoning, he could have died via hanging, perhaps drowning, but it's likely believed that his choice of death was something that is not going to show up on the remains because analysis of the remains from the outside has not shown any trauma or injury to suggest, perhaps he slit his own throat or anything like that. But other things, hanging, drowning, poisoning, those would not leave obvious marks on a 3,000 plus year old mummy. But what about TA? Well, her mummy has never been found. There's no grave. And after this, court document comes out, her name entirely disappears from history. And because no body has ever been found, some Egyptologists actually believe that she too was burned alive, which again was a fate worse than death. And after the judicial documentation, Ramses IV would rule for a short period of time before his own death. And thus, the continuation of handing off power to another individual would continue for another 1,000 years in ancient Egypt. And Ramses III has been immortalized in ruins and art for over 3,000 years. But his death, too, was shrouded in shadows. It was only recently that it was found that he was killed by his wife and son, while his reign was marked by fighting the sea peoples and others as a valiant soldier. It is also remembered for the Harem conspiracy. But what do you guys think? I want to hear from you. Who do you think did it? Do you think his wife and son killed him? Do you think more court officials were involved? Did the harem in its entirety know about it? Or was it somebody else that, wasn't even mentioned in the conspiracy court documentation? Let me know. I'm really interested to see what you guys think about this. But this was such a fun episode to do. Yeah, I was really, drawn to do this episode when I saw the remains in the museum in Cairo. It was crazy, it was amazing. And not only do they have, of course, Ramses III's body there, but they also have other incredible pharaohs of the new kingdom there. You see, of course, many of the Ramesside kings. You also see Thutmose III. You see Hatshepsut. And man, when I tell you that seeing the body of Hatshepsut like brought me to tears, and I can't tell you why, other than when you see like the physical remains of history from thousands of years ago, it just makes it that much more real. And I really can't put it into words other than that. But if you ever get the chance, I highly recommend that museum. It's utterly incredible. With that being said, as always, keep your books open, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.